Hello, I'm Jesse Holt, and today I'll be giving a presentation on international stem cell research and research cloning. Recent advances in stem cell research have a surprising number of countries around the world debating over engaging the use of embryonic stem cells. These countries have all responded differently towards embryonic stem cell research in a number of ethical and political ways that depend on their history, culture, traditions, ethical and religious values, degrees of technological optimism, and their attitudes towards economic development through innovative and scientific research. In the world currently, there are three approaches to stem cell research that Cohen refers to in her book: the permissive approach, the moderate approach, and the restrictive approach. And as with most positions on topics, they range from one extreme to another. Many of the countries have been enticed by strong scientific, therapeutic, ethical, and economic pull of this research include the UK, Japan, China, Israel, Singapore, and South Korea, just to name a few. These countries have all embraced both embryonic stem cell research and research cloning, and have set out in a race to become the centers of stem cell research in the world. Cohen refers to this view as the permissive approach to stem cell research. Although these countries have accepted the use of embryonic stem cells and research cloning for obvious reasons, they don't just let it proceed unattended. They have many strict guidelines and regulations set in place that govern these activities so that they don't get out of control. Certain other countries, including Canada and Spain, that Cohen terms hold a moderate approach, are more reluctant to follow suit in the expansion of stem cell research and research cloning. They consider it to be scientifically and ethically questionable in some respects, and yet scientifically and ethically sound in others. As a result, they authorize only specific forms of embryonic stem cell research and have rejected research cloning entirely. Moreover, they have tended a greater substantive and procedural conditions on the sorts of stem cell research that they allow that countries that have adopted a permissive approach. Finally, there are countries that Cohen terms take a restrictive approach to stem cell research and research cloning. These countries including Italy, Austria, Ireland, and Germany, either place extremely strict constraints on embryonic stem cell research and ban research cloning completely, or prohibit both as unethical and unnecessary. This approach is considerably opposite to the permissive approach and more severely opposed to stem cell research and research cloning in contrast to the moderate approach. Stem cell research policies adopted by countries around the world have not been static, or in other words, they have not changed much, however. Since the turn of the 21st century, there have been trends of sorts to loosen them in some countries and restrict them in others. In other words, this research is currently governed internationally by conflicting sets of shifting regulations, which makes making an internationally unitary judgment of stem cell research and research cloning nearly impossible. Regardless, it is instructive to consider how a few countries with different approaches have grappled this subject with the issues presented in order to understand the United States' approach to stem cell research and research cloning. This chapter will focus on stem cell research policies adopted in the UK, Germany, and Japan, each of which have taken a different approach as to why and how to proceed with this research. The three countries presented are regulated differently by the factors stated before, and each factor has more or less importance depending on the country. For the sake of the presentation, however, I can only focus on the UK stand on stem cell research and research cloning. In the UK, both embryonic stem cell research and research cloning have been approved and put into practice. Embryos remaining at IVF centers may be used in stem cell research, and they are allowed to develop embryos for research through IVF cloning and parthenogenesis. Reproductive cloning remains off limits, however, and for obvious reasons, such as the possibility of human cloning. Basically, the UK has developed a permissive stem cell research policy, but it's also required all stem cell researchers to obtain a license to pursue research projects, and it monitors their acceptance of the research guidelines. This approach results from the country's relatively long engagement with the ethical and political questions surrounding research with human embryos and of its parliamentary form of government, which invests considerable policy control in the hands of the government. The history behind the stem cell research policies in the UK result of the birth of the first child using IVF in 1978 that generated a wave of concern about whether its new technology was being used in ways that protected the health of women and the children involved in the process. In response, a committee of inquiry led by Mary Warnock, a prominent philosopher, was charged by the Conservative Party government with consideration of social, ethical, and legal implications of the application of methods of assisted reproduction and embryo research in the UK, and to recommend policies for their use. A major roadblock for the Warnock Committee, however, was whether research on human embryos should be allowed in order to study the causes of infertility, and if so, under what conditions. The committee fell back on Humean theory of moral sentiments, which basically states that we have a moral sixth sense rather than motives, to convince the public of consideration owed to human embryos. As a result, the majority of the committee held that the stage of development of embryos makes an important difference to the degree of protection it should be afforded, and in turn they ruled that human embryos deserve some measure of respect, but it may be outweighed by the benefits it presents towards the research. However, they did rule that these embryos must only be used for promised medical advances and in treatment and knowledge. The committee went on to suggest the use of remaining embryos from IVF treatment, and through a slim majority they recommended that research should be allowed on embryos created by IVF, regardless of whether it was generated for reproductive purposes or research into infertility, so long as it was after the 14-day process. The report from the Warnock Committee received strong governmental support but a mixed response from the public. Still, the committee received support from many others, including coalitions of scientific and patient advocacy groups, as well as leaders from within the Church of England. The argument for treatments of infertility gradually overcame the anti-abortion groups, and the government adopted the basic recommendations of the committee. As a result, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act was enacted in 1990. The committee had envisioned several future scientific developments, but had not considered the possibility that human embryonic stem cells might be developed or that research cloning might prove a useful source of these cells. However, once embryonic stem cells were successfully cultured in 1998, the UK was the first major nation to tackle the decision of the usage of human embryonic stem cells and how that should be regulated. This time, a committee under Professor Sir Liam Donaldson took on the task of assessing issues with stem cell research and research cloning. The Donaldson Committee recommended embryonic stem cells be included in the Act after rigorous and scientific and ethical review. It also stated that in addition to using stem cells from IVF treatments, they should use cloned stem cells as well as develop treatments for patients who needed immunologically compatible stem cells. The committee stated that assuming research cloning would lead towards reproductive cloning was not realistic because of the stringent controls over the licensing of research on human embryos that would be imposed on researchers in the UK. The government supported the Donaldson Committee's report and amended the Act to include stem cell research and research cloning within regulations. Both committees wrote a permissive approach to research cloning and at the same time enacted strict regulations to govern it as well. Some opposition was met from anti-abortion organizations in response to research cloning, but it was overturned by a majority decision in Parliament. To appease them, however, Parliament passed the Human Reproductive Cloning Act in 2001, which banned cloning human embryos for reproductive purposes. Thank you for listening.